Chapter 3. Baxter strode through the luxurious lobby of La Amethyst, private club for London's intelligentsia. For a middle-aged man, he was fit, with not an ounce of superfluous fat on his 6'2" frame. His toned and muscled body was topped by a monastic grey skullcap of hair, above a brooding expression from alert grey-blue eyes, which missed nothing. He headed purposefully towards the lift that would take him to the private suite he shared with Neath A. Pilgrim, his business partner. Pilgrim had plucked him from a life of obscurity. He'd spent decades as a personal valet to the rich and famous. In truth, he'd already decided to quit his pampered and cosseted existence, to go in search of the man he hoped he might one day become, courageous, adventurous, seeking out life on his own terms. However, being a man of conservative habit, he'd procrastinated until the last minute. He'd left behind a gilded cage, more money than he could shake a stick at, and the admiration of his small but select international peer group, who'd silently cheered him on from behind the windows of their employers' corporate jets and stately homes. Pilgrim had ignited his life. She'd been like a match to his touch paper, and he'd never looked back. She wasn't just unique in her field, she was unique, period. He'd pushed to become her business partner rather than, as she'd suggested, her curator. Together they ran the world's most discreet storage facilities for housing the secret possessions of others. These priceless and in some cases extremely dangerous objects were kept hidden from the scrutiny of governments, kingdoms, and treasure hunters in 7 separate and unique locations on 7 continents. These locations were named the Vaults. There was also one other on the International Space Station, but she hadn't divulged what she kept up there. He'd decided to never inquire about what it might be. He had quite enough to contend with on a terrestrial level. Together they dodged many bullets, come up close and personal with those attempting to either prevent or discover details of their business and its contents, and had survived, scars and all. It was a bespoke service that afforded them a life of luxury that he hoped one day to enjoy. Crossing the lobby, he caught the anxious look on the face of the receptionist as he passed. The moment elongated, threatening to snap. A surge of dread coursed through him. After their last commission, he'd headed straight down to Merrillmar House, their country retreat in Devon, leaving Pilgrim to her own devices. Crushing the feeling of trepidation rising in his chest, he replaced it with a granite resolve to face unflinchingly whatever would confront him up there. Entering their suite, he surveyed the broken furniture and the melted bronze statuette, now solid, lying pooled on the scorched wooden coffee table. The curtains had been ripped from their railings. Interestingly, she hadn't touched the paintings, which still hung, although askew, against walls now covered in graffiti. The ongoing remodelling of their living room was becoming increasingly one of their largest expenditures. It was a wake-up call. She desperately needed to have somewhere contained to vent. "Pilgrim," he bit out angrily, stepping over the wreckage. "Leave me alone," she shouted back tiredly from her bathroom. Picking his way over the debris, he took a deep breath, uncertain what state she'd be in. Holding onto the side of the sink, she pushed herself away, faltering 2 paces back as she hit the bathroom wall behind her. Slowly splaying her fingers, she ran them shakily through her dark, thick hair, away from her face as she leaned her head back, spanning her hand across a throbbing forehead. Hearing him at the door, with her lips parted and her eyes closed, she exhaled. "Shh." Dragging her right knuckle across her mouth, she smudged the remnants from last night's lipstick. Baxter was not impressed, as he leaned against the doorframe taking in her shattered appearance. "Rough doesn't quite do it justice," he ground out, with a hint of underlying concern. She let out a soft laugh as matted tendrils of hair fell across her face. There was no normal with her, despite her usually faultless appearance. Standing at just above medium height, with a slim build and some muscle tone, she should have blended into the crowd. However, invariably, she dominated any environment she entered. It wasn't her looks which commanded the attention of those in her immediate vicinity. It was her demeanour. Instinctively, people felt cautious of her, even if they couldn't quite pinpoint why. The clue to what she kept hidden was in her eyes. They were large in the rarest of blues, which, dependent upon her mood and the circumstances, would change involuntarily from iridescent sapphire to black. She was an anomaly of nature. Within her slumbered a force, both terrifying and destructive, that few had witnessed. Only one had survived its wrath: Baxter. He had experienced its waking presence firsthand, after an instinctual reflex from her, born out of trust, had exposed him, changing him forever. It had bonded him to her, leaving a mental link that allowed them to sense what the other was feeling. The majority of the time, she kept that part of herself sheathed, but cocooned around it was the vulnerability of a person at the mercy of her true nature. He worried about her, especially given days like this. "Happiness," she whispered, looking up at his reflection in the mirror. "What about it?" he asked doubtfully. "Attainable?" "Overrated," he stated conclusively. She ran the cold tap, cupping her hands as the water flowed over them. Leaning over the sink, she lifted water unsteadily to her face. Since they'd become business partners, he'd seen her in worse condition, particularly after they'd handled a difficult collection for the vault. Picking up a towel, he threw it at her, taking note as she missed it and it fell to the floor. The drinking, yes, he understood that. God knows how, as she was half his body weight, but she had the capacity of an Irish navvy. Something was wrong. Not the usual wrong they had to deal with, those that wanted to kill, maim, or choke the living breath from their bodies. This was more serious. She was emotionally compromised, he concluded. He didn't want to ask any inane questions until he'd thought about it carefully, or she'd shut down. He needed to know why she'd allowed herself to get into such a state. He couldn't risk being out there for a collection without her complete focus. Work was always intense, no change there. Maybe their work had become too much of a burden. No, it wasn't anything so obvious. Besides, she lived for those lightning strikes. She always put her hand up in a storm. "The Titans?" he posed. Their personal history with that ancient and dangerous society had almost cost them their lives on more than one occasion. 12 of the highest intellectual minds of their time, honed over millennia, with each superseded by the next. Earth's population had been groomed, kept enslaved as tiny cogs, working day in, day out, profiting them, and kept blissfully unaware of the role that they played in their own impending destruction. Having accumulated 2/3 of the world's wealth in raw materials, the Titans manipulated it for their own ends. Their purpose never wavered. They'd been patient over the centuries, and the time was upon them when technology and science would culminate in the realization of their goal, when the intellectually elite of the elite would remain to fulfill their destiny in creationally evolving the species. They weren't interested in colour, race, gender, age, or physical attributes, as these held no relevance. The one thing they coveted above all else was intellectual agility. They'd been harvesting and distilling genetics from time immemorial. Their ancient history told of a being that would herald the dawn of their new civilization, a being carrying a prophesied genetic strand from the heavens, known to them as the Absu. They trawled through centuries until they discovered Pilgrim, who had one day surfaced on their grid. Believing she carried the Absu, they'd initially tried to reason with her. All attempts had failed in securing her allegiance. Their reasoning had turned to coerciveness, but she'd forcibly resisted, sometimes with catastrophic results. Their most recent attempt to enlist her had resulted in the Titan Kronos' death. Each embattled clash gave up valuable information on her, which they treated as a learning curve. Pilgrim's message was clear. She was firmly on the side of diversity in all its forms. They'd regrouped, knowing they could afford to wait for the most opportune time. Predicting she would eventually come to them, they'd prepared a containment facility to hold her. Their continued presence in Baxter's and her life was a blight. They wouldn't dare. Not after the last time, she replied, with an edge to her voice that confirmed how much she despised them. Hansford, he conjectured. Don't, she whispered raggedly. Hansford was fast becoming a thorn in his side, and he couldn't fully explain what she saw in him. Certainly Hansford held all the carnal cards. He was smart, had a good physique, and was inordinately skilled when it came to handling Pilgrim on an earthly level. Baxter had witnessed the physical influence that Hansford had over her, and it pained him to think of it. Why she'd allowed herself to become so emotionally embroiled was beyond his comprehension. Pilgrim watched from the mirror as he walked back into the living room. She staggered, picking the towel up from the floor, and began dabbing her face, noticing for the first time the dark crescents under her eyes. His reaction was well-founded. She looked thrashed. Her normally clear complexion had turned opaque, accentuating her luminous eyes, which now looked animalistic and haunted. Studying her reflection, she lowered her gaze, her hollowed cheeks and aquiline cheekbones more in evidence. Yesterday, in an effort to divert her thoughts away from Hansford, she'd allowed her body to take the brunt. She hadn't slept. Instead, she'd spent the time drinking and talking to anyone that had given her the time of day. She discussed whatever mundane subject they'd been interested in, but they'd all bailed, eventually. She straightened up. Baxter had come back. She was good. No problem. She should have eaten more, that's all. She'd put his mind at rest. He looked properly pissed. She'd order some food. That would appease him. She hesitated, realizing it must be Thursday. That would mean he'd been away for a week at Merrillmar. God, what did he do down there? Sea fishing with Flint. Crap, she was jealous. She reached out for a toothbrush, knocking over the glass speaker which smashed into the sink. Great, no toothpaste. Who cares? Running her brush under the tap, she proceeded to brush vigorously. Grinning grotesquely in the mirror, she checked her teeth, pulled her t-shirt down and her jeans up. Noticing her shirt was heavily stained, she yanked it over her head, dropping it on the bathroom floor behind her. She entered their living room in just her bra and jeans. The apartment looked like a bomb had hit it. Baxter had righted a chair and now sat languidly taking in the scene. She noted how he looked annoyingly unruffled and perfectly groomed. "Where's Dashwood?" he asked after their butler, whilst eyeing one of her old knife scars just below her rib cage. I gave him the month off. She ignored his feigned surprise as she knotted up her hair. He needed it, she finished honestly, eyeing the floor around her before saying, Now, what am I looking for? Your dignity, he remarked coldly. She looked up, raising her brow in provocation. He knew better than to continue in the same vein. Instead, he stood and walked over to her. Gently lifting her chin, he gazed into her eyes, softly kissing her cheek, and headed towards the door. Where are you going? She demanded desperately. You're a supreme being, for God's sake. He surveyed the wreckage. Unbelievable, he growled disappointedly. We're going to need to find you somewhere you can blow off some steam. His slam of their apartment door made the windows rattle. Baxter, she called out after him. Don't leave me. I can't protect myself, she whispered. Baxter took the stairs down to reception. Mr. Mylar's Lamethist stalwart manager gave him a conciliatory smile, his customary fresh gardenia in his top buttonhole. Although always impeccably attired, nothing seemed to ruffle those carefully groomed feathers. It was all behind Mylor's eyes. Almost the colour of coal, they picked up every nuance and gesture. Baxter wondered how Mylar kept sane, given the fact that he struggled with one gifted person and Mylar had a building full of them. True, Pilgrim was the only one with such exceptional gifts. The other eccentric members consisted of luminaries and world leaders in their chosen fields. Their patronage was by invitation only and not defined by the size of their bank balance, but their ongoing work for the betterment of the planet. Mr. Mylar continued at his work, filling in the day's ledgers. He applied careful strokes, using his customary quill, dipping it into the silver owl inkwell on his desk after drawing its nib across the ink brush. His desk was kept Spartan, but Baxter questioned what might be the purpose of Mr. Mylar's second silver inkwell, fashioned in the shape of a carrion crow. He'd not once witnessed him using it. Baxter walked over to reception and spoke to the concierge. We're going to need a good decorator and plasterer. Have them total the bar. Contact Dashwood and ask him to return at his earliest convenience. We'll take some light chicken soup out on the veranda. Thank you. Right away. It's good to have you back, sir, the concierge underlined. Taking a moment to collect his thoughts, Baxter entered the Art Deco bar. Sitting down heavily, his thoughts were on Pilgrim, as the barman placed a tumbler of whiskey next to him. He looked down into the glass. There were no answers there. Last week he'd run to Merrilmar. He just needed to crash. Their business didn't so much take a toll, it slammed them up against the wall and tore them down before grinding them into the dust. He'd been right to go, but to leave her behind? She'd brushed him off, stated she didn't want to go. Maybe she'd join him later. He shouldn't have given in to her so easily. She was an adult. She could definitely take care of herself. Or could she? He realized he mustn't leave her to her own devices in future. What was her problem? Loneliness? Boredom? Whatever it was, he knew Hansford was at the bottom of it. The possibility it might be loneliness stuck in his throat. He inhaled sharply and hoped it was just boredom. But where was Hansford, damn the man? Didn't he know what was going on? Perhaps it was because he knew what was going on. He needed to talk with her about finding a place she could express herself. As the thought crossed his mind, he doubted such a place existed. Upstairs, Pilgrim swung around in one fluid movement. She looked over their once luxurious living room that she'd laid waste. Her eyes flashed luminous blue as she dropped her head back, slowly stretching out her arm and opening her palm toward the bar. The last cut-glass tumbler shot across into her hand. As she hypnotically drew her fingers around it, she reduced it to molten glass. She allowed it to run dripping through her fingers, shaking her hand slowly by her side as the last drops solidified mid-air, shattering about her as they hit. Suddenly clapping her hands together, she whooped for joy as she headed towards her bedroom. He'd come back, but she wasn't thinking about Baxter. In the bar, Baxter gulped down the last of his whiskey, placing it carefully on the table. Standing, he straightened his shirt sleeves and adjusted his cufflinks. Striding towards the lobby's main staircase, he noted how the staff looked at him expectantly. He didn't hesitate. Moving his head from side to side like a seasoned boxer, he leapt up the stairs. Round 2.